Children, today I will be doing a new chapter with you. The name of the chapter is Fritz by Satyajit Ray, who has authored many short stories and novels. Many of them are aimed at children and adolescents. They are full of twists and suspense that evoke a sense of wonder in the readers. Some of his ghost stories blend atmosphere, emotions, and plot harmoniously to create a feeling of creepiness that rises to a thrilling climax. And this is clearly seen in Fritz, a ghost story with a difference. After having stared at Jayanto for a whole minute, I could not help asking him, "Are you well? You seem to be in low spirits today." So here the narrator has been continuously looking at Jayanto, and after some time he asked him if he was in low spirits, means if he was feeling depressed. Jayanto quickly lost his slightly preoccupied air. Preoccupied air means absent-mindedness. Gave me a boyish smile and said, "No, on the contrary, I am feeling a lot better. This place is truly wonderful. You have been here before? Didn't you know how good it was?" "I had nearly forgotten," Jayanto sighed. "Now some of my memories are coming back slowly. The bungalow certainly appears unchanged. I can even recognize some of the old furniture, such as these cane chairs and tables." So here we come to know that the narrator and Jayanto have come to a particular place. We will learn about this as we read the story further. Here Jayanto says that his old memories is slowly coming back to him, and the bungalow in which they are right now staying, it seems unchanged to Jayanto, because he has he says he still can recognize the old cane chairs and table. The bearer came in with tea and biscuits on a tray. I poured. Bearer is the male servant. The bearer comes with the tea and the narrator pours it. "When did you come here last?" asked the narrator. 31 years ago. I was 6 then." Jayanto informs the narrator that he has been here to this place when he was 6 years old. "We were sitting in the garden of the circuit house in Bundi. We had arrived only that morning. Jayanto and I were old friends. We had gone to the same school and college. He now worked in the editorial division of a newspaper and I taught in a school. Although we had different kinds of jobs, it had not made any difference to our friendship. We had been planning a trip to Rajasthan for quite some time. The main difficulty lay in both of us being able to get away together. They had at last been made possible." Now, circuit house is a rest house. The narrator tells us here that Jayanto and he were childhood friends. They had gone to the same school, even to the same college, and now Jayanto worked in the editorial division of a newspaper, whereas the narrator was a teacher. Since they were good friends, they had been planning several times on coming to Rajasthan, but it was not possible. But this time, finally they made it possible and they were here. Most people go to Jaipur, Udaipur or Chittor when they go to Rajasthan, but Jayanto kept talking about going to Bundi. I had no objection, for having read Tagore's poem, The Fort of Bundi, I was certainly familiar with the name of the place and felt a pleasurable excitement at the prospect of actually seeing the fort. When they were planning to come to Rajasthan, Jayanto had insisted on coming to Bundi. The narrator had not visited Bundi, but he has read the poem written by Tagore, The Fort of Bundi. Not many people came to Bundi, but that did not mean that there was not much to see there. It could be that from the point of view of a historian, Udaipur, Jodhpur and Chittor had a lot more to offer, but simply as a beautiful place, Bundi was perfect. Now the narrator is comparing these places. Bundi is a very beautiful place, though it did not have so much of history to offer like other places in Rajasthan. However, Jayanto's insistence on Bundi did puzzle me somewhat. Puzzle means confuse. I learnt the reason on the train when we were coming down. Jayanto's father, Animesh Das Gupta, had worked in the archaeological department. Now, what is archaeological department? A department devoted to the study of cultures by examining the remains of the building. His work sometimes took him to historical places, and Jayanto had as a child come to Bundi. He had always wanted to return after growing up, just to see how much the modern Bundi compared to the image he had in his mind. In the train, the narrator comes to know why Jayanto was much interested in visiting Bundi. His father had worked in the archaeological department, and his work was to visit the historical places. So once he had come to Bundi and Jayanto had accompanied him. After he had visited Bundi at the age of 6, he made up his mind that one day again he would go back and compare the modern Bundi with the ancient one. The circuit house was really rather splendid. Splendid is excellent. Built during the time of the British, it must have been at least 100 years old. It was a single-storied building with a sloping tiled roof. The rooms had high ceilings and the skylights had long dangling ropes. Long dangling ropes. What are skylights? Skylights are windows which are built into the roof so as to let the sunlight in. Dangling ropes which could be pulled to open and shut them. The veranda faced the east. Right opposite, it was a huge garden with a large number of roses in full bloom. Behind these were a lot of trees which obviously housed a vast section of local birds. Parrots could be seen everywhere and peacocks could be heard, but only outside the compound. Now the circuit house was 100 years old because it was built during the time of British. The room had high ceilings and skylights had long ropes in order to open and close them. There was a garden which had a large number of trees, and those trees provided shelter to the local birds. Parrots and peacocks could be heard. We had already been on a sightseeing tour of the town. The famous fort of Bundi was placed amidst the hills. We had seen it from a distance that day, but decided to go back to take a closer look. The only reminders of modern times were the electric poles. Otherwise, it seemed as though we were back in old Rajputana. The streets were cobbled. The houses had balconies jutting out from the first floor. The carvings done on these and the wooden doors bore evidence of the work of master craftsmen. Evidence means proof, and craftsman means skilled persons. It was difficult to believe we were living in the age of machines. The house had carvings on the windows which told everyone that very talented craftsmen had worked. The narrator said it was Difficult to believe that they were living in the world of machines after looking at this architecture. I noticed Jayanto had turned rather quiet after arriving in Bundi. Perhaps some of his memories had returned. It is easy enough to feel a little depressed when visiting a place one may have seen as a child. Besides, Jayanto was certainly more emotional than most people. Everyone knew that. He put his cup down on the table and said, "You know, Shankar, it is really quite strange. The first time I came here, I used to sit cross-legged on these chairs. It seemed as though I was sitting on a throne. Now the chairs seem both small in size and very ordinary. The drawing room here used to seem absolutely enormous. If I hadn't returned, those memories would have remained stuck in my mind forever." Now Jayanto became very quiet. He was a very emotional person. Jayanto told his friend Shankar that he used to sit cross-legged on the chair, but now everything has changed. I said, "Yes, that's perfectly natural. As a child, one is small in size, so everything else seems large. One grows bigger with age, but the size of all other things remains the same, doesn't it?" We went for a stroll in the garden after tea. Stroll in the garden means we just went for a walk. Jayanto suddenly stopped walking and said, "Deodar." I stared at him. "A deodar tree? It ought to be here somewhere," he said, and began striding. Striding is walking with long steps towards the far end of the compound. Why did he suddenly think of a deodar tree? When they went for a walk after 10, all of a sudden Jayanto stopped and said, "Deodar," and then started walking fast towards the end of the compound, and Shankar was taken aback. A few seconds later, I heard his voice exclaiming jubilantly. Jubilantly means with great happiness. "Yes, it's here. Exactly where it was before." "Of course it's where it was before," I said. "Would a tree go roaming about?" Jayanto shook his head impatiently. "No, that is not what I meant. All I meant was that the tree is where I thought it might be." "But why did you suddenly think of a tree?" Jayanto stared at the trunk of the tree, frowning. Frowning means he was making an angry expression. Then he shook his head slowly and said, "I can't remember that now. Something had brought me near the tree. I had done something here." "A European." "European?" "No, I can't recall anything at all. Memory is a strange business." Now Jayanto himself was not able to understand why he thought of the deodar tree, and suddenly brought there, and suddenly he said European. He himself was a bit confused. They had a good cook in the circuit house. Later in the evening, while we sat at the oval dining table having dinner, Jayanto said the cook they had in those days was called Dilawar. He had a scar on his left cheek and his eyes were always red, but he was an excellent cook. Jayanto's memories began returning one by one soon after dinner when we went back to the drawing room. He could recall where his father used to sit and smoke a cheroot. Cheroot is a cigar. Where his mother used to knit and what magazines lay on the table. All little details were coming back to his mind. And slowly in bits and pieces, he recalled the whole business about his doll. It was not the usual kind of doll little girls play with. One of Jayanto's uncle had brought for him from Switzerland a 12-inch long figure of an old man dressed in traditional Swiss style. Apparently, it was very lifelike. Although it was not mechanized, it was possible to bend and twist its limbs. Its face had a smile on it, and on its head it wore a Swiss cap with a little yellow feather sticking out from it. Sticking out means coming out from it. Its clothes, especially in their little details, were perfect. Belt, buttons, pockets, collars, socks. There were even little buckles on the shoes. So this is the description of the doll. You need to remember that. His uncle had returned from Europe shortly before Jayanto left for Bundi with his parents. The little old man had been bought in a village in Switzerland. The man who sold him had jokingly said to Jayanto's uncle, "He's called Fritz. You must call him by this name. He won't respond to any other." Here we come to know that this doll was gifted to him by his uncle who went to Europe and brought it from Switzerland. The shopkeeper who sold the doll told the uncle that the doll would respond only if he would be called Fritz, and that was said jokingly. Jayanto said, I had a lot of toys when I was small. My parents gave me practically everything I wanted. Perhaps because I was their only child. But once I had Fritz, I forgot all my other toys. I played only with him. A time came when I began to spend hours just talking to him. Our conversation had to be one-sided, of course. But Fritz had such a funny smile on his lips and such a look in his eyes that it seemed to me as though he could understand every word. Sometimes I wondered if he would actually converse with me, if I could speak to him in German. Now it seems like a childlike fantasy, but at that time the whole thing was very real to me. A childish fantasy. At one time he thought he knew the German language and spoke to the doll. The doll would have responded him. My parents did warn me not to overdo things. Overdo means use too much of something. But I listened to no one. I had not yet been put in a school, so I had all the time in the world for Fritz. Jayanto felt silent. I looked at my watch and realized it was 9:30 p.m. It was very quiet outside. We were sitting in the drawing room of the circuit house. An oil lamp burnt in the room. I asked, what happened to the doll? Jayanto was still deep in thought. His answer to my question came so late that by that time I had started to think that he had not heard me at all. I had brought it to Bundi and it was destroyed here. Destroyed means ruined. It was ruined here. Destroyed? How? Jayanto sighed. We were sitting out on the lawn having tea. I had kept the doll by my side on the grass. I was not really old enough to have tea, but I insisted, and in the process the cup tilted and some of the hot tea fell on my pants. I ran inside to change and came back to find that Fritz had disappeared. I looked around and found quite soon that a couple of stray dogs were having a nice tug of war with Fritz. Although he didn't actually come apart, his face was battered beyond recognition and his clothes were torn. Battered means badly damaged. In other words, Fritz did not exist for me anymore. He was dead. Here he relates to an incident when he insisted to have a cup of tea. He was sitting on the lawn and Fritz was lying beside him. He He just somehow tilted the cup and tea fell on his pants, and he went inside to change, and when he came back, he could not find Fritz anywhere. He looked around, and what did he see? He saw a couple of stray dogs were having a nice tug of war, and Fritz was totally destroyed, and for Jayanto, Fritz was dead. And then Jayanto's story intrigued me. Intrigued me means interested me. What could possibly happen after that? I arranged his funeral, that's all. Meaning, I buried him under the deodar tree. I had wanted to make a coffin. Fritz was, after all, a European. But I could find nothing, not even a little box. So in the end, I buried him just like that. At last, the mystery of the deodar tree was solved. We went to bed at around 10. Our room was a large one and our beds had been neatly made. Not being used to doing a lot of walking, I was feeling rather tired after the day's activities. Besides, the bed was very comfortable. I fell asleep barely 10 minutes after hitting the pillow. A slight noise woke me a little later. I turned on my side and found Jayanto sitting up on his bed. The table lamp by his bed was switched on, and its light, it was easy to see the look of anxiety on his face. Anxiety is worry. Now in the middle of the night, the narrator, that is Shankar, he woke up because he heard some noise, and when he looked across, he saw Jayanto on his bed. I asked, "What is it? Are you not feeling well?" Instead of answering my question, Jayanto asked me one himself. "Do you think the circuit house has got small animals? I mean things like cats or mice? I shouldn't be surprised if it does." "Why?" "Something walked over my chest. That's what woke me. Rats and mice usually come in through drains, but I have never known them to climb on the bed. This is the second time I have woken up, actually. The first time I had heard a shuffling noise near the window. Shuffling means to walk without lifting feet. Oh, if it was near the window, it is more likely to be a cat." "Yes, but..." Jayanto still sounded doubtful. I said, "Didn't you see anything after you switched the light on?" "Nothing. But then I didn't switch it on immediately after opening my eyes. To tell you the truth, I felt rather scared at first. But when I did switch it on, there was nothing to be seen. That means whatever came in must still be in the room. Well, since both the doors are bolted from inside, I rose quickly and searched under the bed, behind our suitcases, and everywhere else in the room. I could not find anything. The door to the bathroom was closed. I opened it and was about to start another search when Jayanto called out to me softly, "Shankar." Now when Shankar gets up and he sees Jayanto looking very anxious and worried, he asks him whether he had seen anything. When he had switched on the light, but Jayanto replies by saying that he was very frightened at first when he heard the noise, and even after switching on the light he had not looked for anything. He was too frightened and they are searching the room. I came back to the room. Jayanto was staring hard at the cover of his quilt. Upon seeing me, he pulled a portion of it near the lamp and said, "Look at this." I bent over the cloth and saw tiny brown circular marks on it. I said, "Well, these could have been made by a cat." Jayanto did not say anything. It was obvious that something had deeply disturbed him. But it was 2:30 in the morning. I simply had to get a little more sleep, or I knew I would just keep feeling tired. And we had plans of doing a lot of sightseeing the following day. So, after murmuring a few soothing words means words of comfort, such as "Don't worry, I'm here with you," and "Who knows, those marks may have been on your quilt already when you went to bed." I switched off the light once more and lay down. I had no doubt that Jayanto had only a bad dream. Now Shankar thinks that it was only a kind of nightmare that Jayanto has had. All those memories of his childhood had upset him, obviously, and that was what had led to his dreaming of a cat walking on his chest. I slept soundly for the rest of the night. If there were further disturbances, Jayanto did not tell me about them. But I could see in the morning that he had not slept well. Tonight I must give him one of the tranquilizers. Tranquilizers means drug to reduce anxiety. I brought with me, I thought. We finished our breakfast by 9, as we had planned, and left for the fort. A car had already been arranged. It was almost 9:30 by the time we reached. Some of Jayanto's old forgotten memories began coming back again, though fortunately they had nothing to do with his doll. In fact, his youthful exuberance made me think he had forgotten all about it. Exuberance means excitement. So Shankar notices that Jayanto is back to normal and he's quite excited about the trip and moving around the place and sightseeing. He thinks he has finally forgotten about the incident that had happened in the night. There's that elephant on top of the gate, he exclaimed. And the turrets. Turrets are small towers. And here is the bed made of silver and the throne. Look at that picture on the wall. I saw it the last time. But within an hour, his enthusiasm began to wane. Enthusiasm is zeal. His zeal began to wane. Wane means decline. I was so engrossed myself that I did not notice it at first. But while walking through a hall and looking at the chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, I suddenly realized Jayanto was no longer walking by my side. Where was he? He's asking to himself. Now here chandeliers are large decorative hanging lights. We had a guide with us. Babu has gone out on the terrace, he told me. I came out of the hall and found Jayanto standing absent-mindedly near a wall on the other side of the terrace. He did not seem to notice my presence even when I went and stood beside him. He started when I called him by his name. Jayanto was lost in thoughts, and when Shankar went and called him by his name, he was little startled. What on earth is the matter with you? I asked. Why are you standing here, looking morose even in a beautiful place like this? I can't stand it. Morose is sad. Jayanto simply said, have you finished seeing everything? If so, let's. Had I been alone, I would definitely have spent a little more time at the fort. But one look at Jayanto made me decide in favor of returning to the circuit house. Now Jayanto was looking troubled, so Shankar decided to go back. A road through the hills took us back to town. Jayanto and I were both sitting in the back of the car. I offered him a cigarette, but he refused. I noticed a veiled excitement in the movement of his hands. Veiled is hidden. One moment he placed them near the window, then on his lap, and immediately afterwards began biting his nails. Biting his nails. When you bite your nails, it is a sign of anxiousness. It is a sign of nervousness. Jayanto was quiet by nature. This odd restlessness in him worried me. After about 10 minutes, I could not take it anymore. It might help if you told me about your problem, I said. Jayanto shook his head. It's no use telling you, for you are not going to believe me. Okay, even if I don't believe you, I can at least discuss the matter with you, can't I? Fritz came into our room last night. Those little marks on my quilt were his footprints. There was little I could do at this except catch hold of him by the shoulders and shake him. How could I talk sensibly to someone whose mind was obsessed with such an absurd idea? Absurd means foolish. How could Fritz, a doll which was already buried under the deodar tree, or how could an inanimate thing come alive? You didn't see anything, did you? I said finally. No, but I could distinctly feel that whatever was walking on my chest had 2 feet, not 4. As we got out of the car at the circuit house, I decided that Jayanto must be given a nerve tonic or some such thing. A tranquilizer might not be good enough. I could not allow a 37-year-old man to be so upset by a simple memory from his childhood. I said to Jayanto upon reaching our room, it's nearly 12 o'clock. Should we not be thinking of having a bath? Jayanto says, you go first, and flung himself on the bed. An idea came to my mind in the bath. Perhaps this was the only way to bring Jayanto back to normalcy. So while Shankar was having a bath, he thought of a plan. A plan which could help his friend to come back to normalcy, to be normal again. If a doll had been buried somewhere 30 years ago, and if one knew the exact spot, it might be possible to dig the ground there. No doubt, most of it would have been destroyed, but it was likely that we would find just a few things, especially if they were made of metal, such as the buckle of a belt or brass buttons on a jacket. If Jayanto could actually be shown that that was all that was left of his precious doll, he might be able to rid himself of his weird notions. Weird notions means strange ideas. Otherwise, he would have strange dreams every night and talk of Fritz walking on his chest. If this kind of thing was allowed to continue, he might go totally mad. He thinks if they had to go and dig up the place near the deodar tree where he had buried Fritz, they would definitely find a metal buckle or a brass button that belonged to the doll. And then he could change Jayanto's way of thinking about Fritz coming back to him. Jayanto seemed to like my idea at first, but after a little while he said, who will do the digging? Where will you find a spade? I laughed. Since there is a garden, there is bound to be a gardener. And that would mean there is a spade. If we offered him a little tip, I have no doubt that he would have no objection to digging up a bit of the ground near the trunk of a tree at the far end of the lawn. Jayanto did not accept the idea immediately. Nor did I say anything further. He went and had his bath. After a little bit of persuasion, at lunch he ate nothing except a couple of chapatis with meat curry, although I knew he was quite fond of his food. After lunch, we went and sat in the cane chairs on the veranda and overlooked the garden. These appeared to be no one else in the circuit house. There was something eerie about the silence that afternoon. Eerie means mysterious or frightening. All we could hear was the noise made by a few monkeys sitting on the gulmohar tree across the cobbled path. Here the narrator has described the scene like there was some mysterious air that afternoon. Around 3 p.m., we saw a man come into the garden carrying a watering can. He was an old man. His hair, moustaches and sideburns all were white. Will you ask him or should I? At this question from Jayanto, I raised a reassuring hand and went straight to the gardener. After I had spoken to him, he looked at me rather suspiciously. Clearly, no one had ever made such a request. Why? Because it was a very strange request. Why, Babu? He asked. I laid a friendly hand on his shoulder and said, don't worry about the reason. I'll give you 5 rupees. Please do as you are told. He relented. Relented means agreed. Going so far to give me a salute accompanied by a broad grin. Grin is wide smile. I beckoned to Jayanto, who was still sitting on the veranda. He rose and began walking towards me. As he came closer, I saw the pallor on his face. Pallor means paleness. I did hope we could find at least some part of the doll. The gardener, in the meantime, had fetched a spade. Fetched means he brought a spade. The 3 of us made our way to the deodar tree. Jayanto pointed at the ground about a yard from the trunk of the tree and said, here. So we see at the end that they do dig up the ground near the deodar tree, and what do they find here? We'll see. Jayanto showed the spot where he had buried Fritz. Are you sure? I asked him. Jayanto nodded silently. How much did you dig? At least 8 inches. The gardener started digging. The man had a sense of humor. As he lifted his spade, he asked if there was hidden treasure under the ground, and if so, whether we would be prepared to share it with him. I had to laugh at this, but Jayanto's face did not register even the slightest trace of amusement. Trace means sign. It was the month of October and not at all warm in Bundi. Yet the collar of his shirt was soaked in sweat. He was staring at the ground unblinkingly. The gardener continued to dig. Why was there no sign of the doll? The raucous cry of a peacock. Raucous means long and rough. Cry of a peacock made me turn my head for a moment, and in that instant, Jayanto made a strange sound. I quickly looked at him. His eyes were bulging. He raised his right hand and pointed at a hole in the ground with a finger that was visibly trembling. Then he asked in a voice turned hoarse with fear. Hoarse means rough. What is that? The spade slipped from the gardener's hand. I too gaped at the ground, open-mouthed in horror. Gaped means kept on staring. I also looked at the ground, open-mouthed in horror, amazement and disbelief. There lay at our feet, covered in dust, lying flat on its back, a 12-inch long, pure white, perfect little human skeleton. So we see at the end that they do dig up the ground near the deodar tree, and what do they find? They find a 12-inch long, pure white, perfect little human skeleton. Now remember, Fritz was a doll, and here the narrator tells us that they find a skeleton. We cannot expect a skeleton of a doll, but was this possible? So this story is left here, children, and it is an open-end story. The author has concluded this story in such a way that the reader has to draw his or her own conclusion. With this, we come to the end of the chapter. Thank you.